So there is yet another act of Islamic terrorism in the United States, this time at Ohio State University. An 18-year-old Somali-born Muslim third-year student at Ohio State carries out an overt act of terror. But Governor John Kasich, Ohio Governor John Kasich, not exactly sure what the motivation is. And listen to what the White House has to say. And notice how they dance around the words Islamic terror, Islamic extremism. Listen to this response from Press Secretary Josh Earnest.
There is plenty of available evidence to indicate that this individual may have been motivated by extremism and may have been motivated by a desire to carry out an act of terrorism. And we know that our law enforcement officers have a critical role to play in preventing those acts of terrorism from succeeding. There are more than 100 joint terrorism task forces that are organized in communities all across the country that fight crime, that fight extremism, that fight terrorism on a daily basis.
It's almost painful to listen to that. With all respect to those that are fighting against terrorism, specifically Islamic terrorism, it's painful to listen to how the words Islam, Islamic terror are completely avoided. Rather, it could have been motivated by extremism. What kind of extremism? It could have been carrying out an act of terror. What kind of terror? How can you fight an ideology if you refuse to identify that ideology? Why is it the Department of Justice scrubbed references in books that were being used, guidelines, source books that were talking about how to identify these acts of terror, scrub words having to do with Islam from them lest they offend Muslims? How can we do this effectively? Now listen, this young man 3 months ago, ironically, in an interview in an Ohio State newspaper called The Lantern, talked about being a Muslim on campus, talked about he didn't like the way the media portrayed Muslims. He was offended by that. And he said, that's not who we are. And then something like 3 minutes before his terrorist attack at Ohio State, and of course he was shot dead, thankfully, by police before he could inflict more terror, there is a Facebook post that is associated with him. And listen to what he says. I can't take it anymore. America, stop interfering with other countries, especially the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim community. We are not weak. We are not weak. Remember that. And he also references the radical Islamic cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed by a drone strike in Yemen a few years back, and who was an inspiration to the Fort Hood jihadist as well a few years back. He references him, but our government will not call it Islamic terror. Please, listen. When you call it Islamic terror, you're saying that not all Muslims are terrorists. When you call it Islamic extremism, you're saying that not all Muslims are extremists. You are making a distinction. When you call it radical Islam, you're saying not all Muslims are radical. But when you refuse to mention Islam, Islamic terrorism, radical Islam, you shoot yourself in the foot. You make it all the more difficult to identify the problems ideologically and practically, and we only guarantee that we'll continue to have problems like this. Come on. Lives are being lost. It's time we throw out this PC garbage.